I came to Columbus because my cousin was marrying a woman from Columbus, and her family still lived here, and they decided to get married in Columbus, and so a decent portion of the family came rolling in to get married, and they said his mother worked in commercial real estate, and she knew somebody who owned a farm, and the reception was going to be on a farm. Oh, that's nice. The reception is going to be on a farm. So we drove out to this farm for the reception. We had directions. There was the wedding was in town, and then the wedding was, that's right, the wedding was there too. The rehearsal dinner the night before was in town. We drove out there, and we entered the gates of this farm, and then we drove like a mile and a half, like to get from there to the buildings, and I realized this isn't like a farm like we have in Wisconsin. This is like some other kind of farm. And there were horses running around, really beautiful horses, and I realized this was a horse farm. We get up to the front, and there were guys in tuxedos who were valet parking people, and then we go out for the wedding, and it's on the patio behind this very nice, very sort of tasteful building. And we're told that across the river, or the creek or whatever it is, the owner of the farm had an African wildlife refuge, and at any moment, animals might come down and feed at the river, like zebras might come down or something. It was just bizarre. And then we got back inside, and the drinks and hors d'oeuvres were served in the trophy room. So you go into this room, and the trophies were for the World Series, the Preakness, the Kentucky Derby, and all this kind of stuff. So I'm just standing around in awe the whole time. And then I noticed there's one little card on the wall that said, "Thank you for your hospitality on my recent visit," all written in a woman's handwriting. "Thank you for your hospitality on my recent visit. Best regards, Elizabeth." And I realized, like, it's that Elizabeth. And sure enough, there was a picture. And so the Queen apparently had stayed there during her trip to some sort of horse auction. So apparently you have some sort of horse people around here. It was my one experience of Columbus. I am a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, so I'm very familiar with losing football games to Ohio State. We've won a couple of them over the years. It's always a big deal. But somehow in my mind, we win about half the time. And then I went back before I came and I looked at the record. It's not half the time. It's not even close to half the time. It's something much more tragic than that. So I want to encourage people to ask questions, raise your hand, make comments, ask for things that maybe I'm not presenting. I may not have the answers. I might have the answers. I might have an idea for getting the answers. I might pretend I have the answers and pretend really well so that you can't tell that I'm pretending. So the title of this is Understanding Trauma in Reading, Connecting the Dots of Science and Reason. The reason I say that connecting the dots, first of all, saying that we're going to understand trauma in reading, you should really say we're going to understand trauma in reading better. It's not like we're really going to understand that. I'm going to tell you in a little bit about a study that I found out is being initiated right now by some folks in Florida with a gigantic federal grant that's really just quite brilliant, and I'm very excited. I consulted with them a little bit on it and helped them with it a little bit informally. I'm very excited to see how that's going to go, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But connecting the dots of science and reading. So one of the things I want to tell you is if you want to go and like read, so tell me the study that's going to tell me all about trauma and reading, it doesn't work that way. You know, one of the things that's really horrible about the way we consume research in the field of education is that we've been misled by an awful little thing called the What Works Clearinghouse into thinking that if you want to understand the science of something, you go look for a study that's going to be about the exact thing that you want to understand. And if there's 4 of them, then your problem is solved. That's not how science works. Science is about taking something from here and something from here and something from here and looking at converged science, looking at what we know from human development, what we know about reading, what we know about neurology and neuroscience, what we know about other parts of education, what we know about from people who study delinquency and study sociology and anthropology and look at things differently, and pulling all this together in a way that helps get us to a deeper understanding. There is one study that's pretty good. It was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association back in 2002. It's a pediatrics article on violence, exposure, trauma, and IQ and or reading deficits among urban children. Because of the nature of the study, they struggled to tell the difference. You know, one of the things that happens when you look at the impact of trauma, particularly repeated trauma and stress, on reading ability, it's very difficult to separate that from what we consider sort of general intelligence. Because trauma and stress suppress, I'm not trying to say IQ is the be-all and end-all of everything, but whatever it is that we measure with IQ tests, it suppresses that. It pushes it down. It pushes everything down. It pushes reading down. So depending on how you design your study and how you construe that information, if you're looking for kids who read worse than their other intellectual gifts would predict, you may not notice how much trauma has done to them because trauma has pushed it all down. Trauma has pushed everything down. It may push reading down more than other things, and there's good reason to believe that it will. So the other study that's going on, it's being led by, it's really a wonderful guy. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see Hugh Katz or meet Hugh Katz, but just a spectacular human being down in Florida. Hugh is part of a large team that's looking at, so if I said the word gap, you all know what I mean by the word gap, right? So the study that leads to us understanding the word gap was a study done back in the 90s, the best we could do at the time by Hart and Risley, that showed that kids from impoverished, stressed backgrounds heard fewer words. They were just exposed to fewer words than kids from wealthier, more affluent backgrounds. And by the time they went to school, the difference wasn't like a few words. It was millions and millions and millions of words that one group of kids had heard. So their brain had been drenched in millions more words, many millions more words than the other kids had. And it wasn't just the words. It was the quality of the words. They heard different words. They heard words arranged into more complex, dynamic sentences. They had more give and take interpersonal social conversations, relationships. They had more conversations. Their words tended to be more about conversations than for kids who came from traumatized and stressed backgrounds. And from this, we got the recognition of how critically important the word gap is. So many kids arrive at school, and their brain has just been fed fewer words than other children have, and it puts them at a tremendous deficit. Hugh and some people down in Florida, with the help of a lot of other people, are going to be doing a study. They're going to be putting, I don't know if it's Alexa or Alexa-like devices using modern technology. They're going to put these devices strategically placed, more than one of them, in people's homes for 4 years. They're going to use computers to monitor every word that is said in those homes. Not like a transcript. It's not creepy Big Brother crap where they're going to like, you know, on such and such a day you said this. It's going to monitor these words and these speech patterns in the aggregate, not specific ones. You're not going to be able to pull specific things out. And it's going to watch, it's going to listen systematically 24 hours a day to what people say, what they say, who says it, the language structure, the words that are used, and we're going to then be able to, this is going to be thousands of families, we're going to be able to correlate that with educational level, their zip code, their level of poverty, how often they move, stresses and traumas. That's part of what I was consulting with, was how to best measure the level of trauma and stress in these families and in these children. We're going to be looking at the effect of direct trauma on children, on how it affects their language development. We're going to be looking at how indirect trauma, so the children may never have been directly traumatized, but they live in a family with people who have been directly traumatized. Because we get language from other people, we believe that will have a substantial impact on the way language is used and how it develops in these families. This is going to produce a data set of information that is probably going to be the backbone of tenure for 20 or 30 people. You know, this is going to produce epic amounts of publication and reports and research. That's going to be we're going to be digging into this for decades, and I anxiously await it. I'm not sure when they're going to start, but it's going to change our understanding of child development, of language development, of the interaction between these things. Sadly, in the What Works, not that it'll matter because they're not selling a product, and that's what Works Clearinghouse reviews. From a What Works Clearinghouse perspective, they would dismiss it because it wouldn't be enough, because it would only be one study. There wouldn't be 3 more. There are never going to be 3 more. You know, like, you can't do this study 4 times. You can do crappy little studies, 4, 5, 10, 15 studies, but great big giant studies have to be done once or maybe twice, and then carefully linked and connected through the convergence of science to other studies. Some background on psycho-emotional trauma. So how many of you have heard the term trauma-informed care? Everybody's, you know, I do a lot of training with police officers. I've trained 2,000 or 3,000 police officers to try to make them better police officers. And I really appreciate working with them, and I work shoulder to shoulder with police officers for a long time. I've been on hundreds of calls with police officers, and I have a great deal of respect for them. But when I ask that question in a room full of police officers, how many of you have ever heard of trauma-informed care? Nobody's hand goes up. So it's just the recognition of how different our worlds are. You know, when I talk to teachers or other mental health professionals, everybody has heard of trauma-informed care. One of the things I want to say about trauma-informed care is the impression people get about trauma-informed care sometimes is that we just sort of figured out not that long ago that, wow, trauma is a big deal. Maybe some of the problems these kids are having is that they've been traumatized. That's not really true. We've known for a long time, certainly as long as I've been alive and as long as people were alive before me, that trauma has a major impact in the lives of children. You know, when I was first starting in my career and I spent more time with some of the tortured kids that I saw, kids who were, I knew a kid who was 9 years old, and his mother held a gun to his head and made him dig his own grave and told him when it was deep enough she was going to shoot him. We didn't miss the fact that experience had a dramatic impact on him. I wasn't waiting for Oprah to come to Milwaukee. I wasn't waiting for Dr. Phil. God, I hate that man. To, Lord have mercy. If you need to know why, I'll tell you later, but Dr. Phil is a pimp. God, I hate that man. I got to not go down that road because we're going to spend the whole rest of the time talking about Dr. Phil, but it's not like we needed somebody to come and tell us that was going on. What trauma-informed care is about, what trauma-informed care and the new recognition of trauma is about, because we always recognize, so trauma occurs on a continuum. So he asked me before if I was going to stand behind the podium and wander around. That question is about to be answered. So trauma occurs on a continuum from, extraordinarily little mild traumas, we would debate whether they were really traumas, up to really spectacular traumas that everybody would acknowledge were traumas. Interesting thing about this, and this study has been done, you can make a list of like 150 or 200 hypothetical traumas. Just, having your dog die at an old age, seeing people murdered and dismembered in front of you, things on all kinds of different points on the continuum. Just, you can make that list. You can give it to people. You can give it to people here. You can give it to white people, black people, rich people, poor people, educated people, uneducated people, people here, France, England, Africa, Asia. You can give it to people in India and China and Russia. Everybody puts those traumas in about the same order. If you ask them to rank them from mild to severe, it is trauma. We have an innate human understanding of trauma. What's the worst and what's not? There's little differences between people. People debate, does this one 100th or is it 99th? But there's nobody in the world who takes a trauma that you or I would put up here at like the worst and says, oh, I don't think that's any big deal. By and large, we put them in the same order. There's remarkable inter-rater reliability across cultures and time and gender and background about what's the most severe kind of trauma. What trauma-informed care about is not this stuff up here, not the sort of high-end movie of the week sort of trauma. What trauma-informed care about is built on the recognition that most of the effective trauma that we see, most of the trauma that's burdening our communities and our schools and our children and our families, is lower grade trauma, which is repeated over and over again. It's not this stuff up here. This stuff up here, thank God, is really, really rare. It's not common. It's, you know, I've seen a fair amount of it because I worked in a job, and part of my job was to stand there and have people bring this stuff to me. This stuff is remarkably rare. This stuff is more common. This stuff is all over the damn place. And some kids are experiencing 2, 3, 4, 5 low-grade traumas a day, a week. They're going on all the time. They're experiencing moderate and mid-level trauma at a frightening rate with extraordinary consistency. And that in some ways this is worse for kids than this. The fact of the matter is, people who experience really spectacular, high-level, dramatic, just soul-shattering trauma, most of them experience it in a context in which they're experiencing this kind of stuff all the time. People who experience these kinds of things in an isolated form in a life which is otherwise very kind and loving and safe and secure and protective actually recover from this stuff remarkably well. It's when they experience this stuff repeatedly or experience it in a context in which moderate trauma and neglect are constant that they don't have a chance to recover from this stuff. This is going to sound strange. The kid who had the gun held to his head and made to dig his own grave, that was bad enough. The bigger problem was it was his mother, and she was a load of shit all the time. So he never had a chance to recover from that. He never had a chance to heal from that. All of that was in the context of this. You see kids, you all, I'm just assuming you're all teachers, right? Or something like that. I'm probably the only one in the room who isn't. So you have kids in your class who experience semi-frequent abuse. But if in between that abuse, they are otherwise loved and well cared for. Now that may be hard to imagine, but there are a lot of kids in our communities who are periodically experience something we would all consider abusive. But if in between that, they are loved and cared for, they are not neglected, their ability to survive and recover and develop in spite of that abuse is really quite remarkable. If in between the abuse they are neglected and not loved and not cared for, the impact of the abuse is spectacular. And in fact, the impact of the neglect is quite extraordinary. I saw some heads nodding when I mentioned reactive attachment disorder, and some of you may have encountered kids who had that diagnosis. If the diagnosis is given properly, reactive attachment disorder is not a condition. It's among the most profound conditions you can possibly have. Reactive attachment disorder is not a condition that children have because they were abused. It's because they were persistently, consistently neglected. They were not loved, they were not cared for, they were not picked up, they were not held, they were not spoken to. Reactive attachment disorder is not because bad things happen to you, it's because good things didn't happen to you. And it is more severe, more profound in many ways than anything else that we confront. So when we talk about trauma-informed care, the growing recognition of the importance of trauma, this emerging idea of the critical importance of trauma, it's the recognition that it's these moderate and mild traumas, particularly when they are repeated over and over again, that are really impactful on people. I realize now, looking back on the earlier stages of my career, that while I was very attuned to this, I was less aware of this. And one reason for that is that blinds you. You know, when you get distracted by the big stuff, you tend not to notice the little things. You know, when you see a kid who's got, 50 cigarette burns on his body, then you see a kid who's got one, you're like, hey, he's only got one. You know, it changes the way the world looks to you. And it changes the way the world looks to these kids and in their families too. I've seen girls who were sexually assaulted try to cope with that in a family where the level of sexual assault towards women in this family was so high, it was so deep and so wide. It went back so many generations. It was so frequent. It was so constant. It was so consistent that the reaction of people was like, yeah, what, because that changes our perspective. So some background on psychoemotional trauma. Trauma, a synonym for trauma is injury. Injury. If you go to a high-level emergency room because you're in a car accident, it's sometimes called a trauma center. They're referring to a different kind of trauma, but they're referring to injury. People who suffer severe injury. Injuries are traumas. Traumas are injuries. When we call this psychosocial, psycho-emotional thing that we're talking about here trauma, we're saying it's an injury. And that's right. It's absolutely an injury. It's a developmental injury. It's a human injury. It's a deep injury to the human soul to have experienced these kinds of things, either one time very acutely or an accumulated injury over time that just wears somebody down. It is very much an injury. It is not a poorly chosen word. It is not chosen for effect. It is absolutely an injury. The psychological injuries that we call trauma are every bit as real as the physical injuries, but they are harder to see. They are harder to see. I have a friend who is he's a board-certified plastics and hand surgeon. He's one of the finest reconstructive surgeons in the world. He does work at the VA in Milwaukee, and he does these repeated surgeries with nerve grafts and other things, getting men who've been injured in combat, helping them to regain function in their hand and in their arm. So they're very detailed, often microscopic surgeries, and to save people from the dangers of anesthesia, many of them are done under nerve blocks. He can block the nerves to your arm, and he can do surgery on your arm, and they strap it down and they put sandbags on it so you don't move, and they give you a mild sedative so you just chill and you don't feel like you want to get up and run around the room or anything. But then he's doing these surgeries that sometimes last hours with these young men who've been through some extraordinary experiences, and they're in a relaxed state. And one of his questions to me was, did I know of anybody, did I know of a therapist? What did I think of the idea of somebody coming in and doing therapy with them? Because while he's doing surgery on them, they're talking to him about the psychological trauma that they've experienced as a result of this injury. And he realized, for all of his skill, like he said, I'm just putting their arms back together. I'm realizing now that's the least of it. The fact that their hand doesn't work, that their arm doesn't work, that their fingers don't work is the least of it in terms of what they need healed. That their psychological injuries are very much real. We can see it in many ways. Just like we can see a bruise or a broken bone in an x-ray, you need to know what to look for. We see the emotional effects. We see the distancing. We see the vigilance. We see the overreactivity. We see children who have lost their confidence that the world is safe, who start to behave in the world as though it is more dangerous than it really is. All of us, by the way, behave in the world as though it is less dangerous than it really is. One of the features of healthy, secure people is that they walk around the world as though nothing bad can happen to them. That's a good thing. If you lose that, if you start to see the world, not only see the danger in the world as it really is, but start to perceive dangers that aren't really there, or exaggerate dangers to higher and higher levels, it starts to overwhelm you. So, this is a small enough room we can have a show of hands. One of the things we see is hypervigilance, children and adults who are more on guard, more attuned, expending way too much mental energy, paying attention to what's going on around them, always very sensitive, always very alert to anything that might go wrong, to anything that might be a threat, very prepared to react. Sometimes these are kids who sit only in certain places in the room. A standard question when I used to do more of this work, when I thought I saw a child who I thought had a history of trauma, was hypervigilant, who rode a school bus, I would always ask them the same question. Is there better and worse places to sit on the school bus? Oh, yes. Tell me what they are. There's two answers. You can think this through for yourself. I either always sit towards the front of the bus. Why? Because if something happens, I can get off quickly. Or I sit all the way at the back of the bus. Why? So that everything's in front of me and I can see what's going on. I've walked with kids in school when I did crisis work. I've walked kids to the cafeteria as we were having a conversation, and we're still talking, and they get their lunch, and they sit down, and they say, there's no place to sit. They say, there's a lot of places to sit. I would never sit there. They would never sit in the middle of the room. They would only sit around the outside. I've been in middle school and high school cafeterias where the outside of the cafeteria is lined with kids who are watching everything, paying attention to everything, paying very close attention to that. Imagine how exhausting that is. How much mental energy and stress that puts on you to have to do that all the time. We see the developmental effects. Kids who are traumatized develop differently. Kids who are exposed to that kind of developmental stress move. If development is an upward slope, it's an upward arc, if you will, towards healthy adulthood and healthy living, they are on a different arc. They are on a different trajectory as a result of this traumatic stress. And it's not just the traumatic stress that they experience, it's the traumatic stress that is experienced and is accumulated by the people around them. One of the things, and I know you realize this, but it pays to make it more manifest, is the children we work with, children come with all these other people attached. They come with families and brothers and sisters and parents and aunts and uncles and neighborhoods and friends in a way that adults sometimes do not. And the things that affect them, particularly the things that affect their mothers, usually their primary caretaker, always have a deep effect on the children. We see academic effects. Kids who have been traumatized struggle to do as well at school. They struggle to show us what they know how to do, and they struggle to learn new things. This is not surprising when so much of your brain and your energy is being dedicated to keeping you safe and guarding against all the bad things that can happen. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that one of the curious things that happens with people who are exposed to trauma is they are sometimes hypersensitive to tiny little things and bizarrely calm about giant things. I worked with a kid. I went to see him at his house. He was sitting with his grandma and his aunts in a beautiful older home in a neighborhood that had started to fall apart, but you could see the beauty of this old home in Milwaukee. It was the summertime. And I was talking to him, and every time I reached for something, every time I reached for my bag, every time I reached in my pocket, he was visibly nervous about what I was doing. But this is a kid who at 3 o'clock in the morning would walk through an incredibly dangerous neighborhood. He would strip down to his boxer shorts and go barefoot and walk through the neighborhood and would walk up to dangerous people and turn his back on them and stand like, look at me. You could do anything to me. I'm not even afraid of you. And we talked about it, and I said, does your pulse go up? No. Do you feel nervous? Not at all. but I could reach for a pen in my pocket and he would be startled. I saw a young man some years ago who had experienced a great deal of trauma. Everybody in his family had experienced a great deal of trauma. His older brother and the brother's girlfriend and their infant had all been murdered in the house. They had been found by his brother, who was 7 or 8 at the time. And he said to me, he said, because he lives in this neighborhood, my brother knew what to do when he found their bodies. And I naively said, call 911. And he said, no, he went through their pockets first. Some months later, I was at his house. It was summertime, and I was trying to help. The young man was having a panic attack, and they called me, and I went to his house, and I was trying to help him. It was dark outside on a street in Milwaukee. You wouldn't know where it was, about 23rd and Brown, which means it was in the middle of everything. And his window was open, and the house was very warm. And somebody ripped off a few dozen rounds of automatic weapons fire on the street outside. I know the difference between automatic and semi-automatic. This was a machine gun. This was, 20 or 30 rounds in about a second and a half. You could hear them hitting cars. And I did what every good suburban white man does. I threw myself on the ground. And I looked up, and his 8-year-old brother, everybody else was just standing there looking at me, and his 8-year-old brother was standing there eating a bag of chips. And he looked down at me, very concerned about me, and he said, it's okay. He said, you don't have to do that. They're not shooting at us. That he had learned to tell the difference between gunfire that was coming at you and gunfire that wasn't coming at you. So it didn't bother him to hear gunfire. He wasn't worried about what happened. Some people who work for me on our crisis team just this last year were at a house last summer, and a gunfight broke out in the street outside. They tried to gather everybody in the house and go to the back of the house for safety. And everybody in the house, mom, grandma, the aunt, older kids, younger kids, everybody in the house wanted to break free of them and go out on the porch and see the gunfight and see what was going on. It's extraordinary that we can have both reactions in the same person, that they can be both hypersensitive to threat and immune, numb to the threats that are around them. Everybody knows one of the trauma and stress-based diagnoses, PTSD. One of the things, so from a reading point of view, I have to tell you one of the things that frustrates me, and I try to stay out of this argument. I sometimes get involved in Facebook posts and message room posts online where people talk about their kid has had this terrible experience with dyslexia and nobody helped them, and I don't question for a minute that that's true. And they were very frustrated with the schools, and in many parts of the country, particularly where I live in Wisconsin, that's almost always true. And then they say my kid has PTSD from his dyslexia. And then I made the mistake one time, and I said, your kid does not have PTSD from dyslexia. They may have a lot of stress-based diagnosis, but it's not PTSD. People got really pissed at me because I was saying their kid didn't have PTSD. PTSD is seen as sort of the pinnacle of stress-based diagnoses. The problem with that is it sort of implies that if you don't have PTSD, then you haven't really been affected. The vast majority of people who have a stress or trauma-based diagnosis would not qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. I could put it up on the screen for you, but you don't need to go into all this. There are 2 very detailed columns of things that you have to meet a standard of PTSD. The first is what's called a Criterion A event. And a Criterion A event for PTSD does not include the ongoing stress and frustration of your dyslexia not being treated, although that can be a tremendous stress and trauma. It's not a Criterion A event. A Criterion A event requires that you or somebody close to you had their life threatened or were sexually assaulted or actually died. So somebody next to you was killed, almost killed, you thought they were going to be killed, a reasonable person thought they were being killed, or you were sexually assaulted, or a reasonable person thought you were going to be sexually assaulted. Those are the only things that qualify as Criterion A events. So you have to have one of those, and then you have to have a very specific set of behavioral and psychological responses to that Criterion A event. Some of them are well known, things like flashbacks. intrusive thoughts, but you have to have a lot of them and they have to be persistent over time. Very few people meet the standard for PTSD. It's a slightly different standard for children 6 and under. It's a little easier to meet it, but it's also harder to interview the children. There's also something called acute stress disorder. In acute stress disorder, people have the criterion A event, but they don't have all the symptoms. Acute stress disorder is probably, and it comes on sooner, and ideally, it's an acute phase and we recover. The other thing to understand about PTSD, and this is an important distinction, PTSD is not the response. PTSD is not the response to a traumatic event. PTSD is the failure to heal appropriately from the traumatic event. If I exposed all of you to a severe enough trauma, you would all have a deep emotional and neurological reaction to that trauma. You might not sleep well tonight. It would intrude on your thoughts. You might have a bad dream. You would not feel like you were self for several days, maybe longer. It would continue to intrude into your life. That's not PTSD. It's PTSD went into the future at a time when we would typically expect people to have recovered from this. You're still having a large bushel basket of symptoms. The diagnosis you would see, if it was given properly, extensively in your schools, is adjustment disorder. Adjustment disorder gets a bad name because it sounds kind of trivial, but adjustment disorder can be every bit as severe as PTSD and acute stress disorder. Adjustment disorder is just what it sounds like when a person struggles to adjust to a stress or trauma that has affected their life. Oftentimes a stress or trauma which is not a criterion A event. You know, if your stress is that when you come home, your mom screams at you, or your dad, when he comes home drunk at night, hits you, that is not a criterion A event. You can't have PTSD from that. If you're worried that there's not going to be food, if you're worried about being beaten up, going to and from school, one of the interesting things that I like to point out to people who are unaware of this, it's less common now, but used to see a lot of places in the city and other places around the country where you would see somebody's shoes tied together and thrown up over an electrical line. You have to understand how that happens. That happens because you steal somebody's shoes and then you punk them by tying their shoes together and throwing them in the air a bunch of times till they get stuck on the line. And it's a message to everybody in the neighborhood, look what I did to this kid. They couldn't fight back, they couldn't stop me. It's a horribly embarrassing thing to have your shoes thrown up on the line. If your shoes are, I've known kids who wouldn't go to school after that. They wouldn't go anyplace. They didn't want anybody to see that. Adjustment disorders can affect behavior, they can affect mood, they can provoke depression, they can cause anxiety, they can cause symptoms which resemble the B column of PTSD. They are pervasive. One of the challenges we have with adjustment disorders is in some more urban school settings, they are so common and so pervasive that we don't notice them because everybody's got them. It just doesn't show up. You know, we don't notice it. We don't recognize how much of this is going on. How many of our children have already had the arc of their development, the path of their development bent and twisted by the experiences that they have and the things that have been missing. And then there's this category called other trauma and stress-related disorders because we didn't want to leave anybody out. It's a two-way street. Yes, kids with trauma are harder to teach. They are harder to teach, they are harder to talk to, they are harder to parent, they are harder to be friends with, they are harder to get along with, they are harder to employ, they are harder to reason with, they're harder to do therapy with. Any interpersonal connection with people who have experienced trauma is likely to make it more difficult to have that experience. Yes, kids with trauma struggle to learn. We understand why they struggle to learn. They struggle to learn for two reasons. They struggle to learn for the distant reason, that is, because of the trauma and the history of trauma in their life and the stress in their life, there's a There's a lot of experiences they haven't had. There's a lot of relationships they haven't had. There's a lot of richness to life that they haven't been able to experience. You know, if you go to the zoo, as a non-traumatized child, you have a different experience than if you go as a traumatized child, because you're not spending all the same energy guarding yourself, watching, worrying, wondering what's going on behind you, paying attention to every little sound and movement. So you have more time to more fully and deeply experience the richness of this experience. So there's that. There's all the things that have happened and not happened in their life. There's also the fact that while they're with you in school, they are hypervigilant, they are depressed, they are anxious, they are worried, they are ready oftentimes on a hair trigger to react to the smallest things. What we see as the smallest things, what to them are surely signs that something terrible is about to happen. Yes, if they weren't traumatized, if their trauma was better treated, their learning would be improved. You know, it's absolutely true. If you want to speculate on it, it's absolutely true that if they had not been traumatized, if they had not been neglected, if they had been given a more ideal life, if they had been given all the experiences we wanted them to have, if they had been sheltered from all the terrible things that may have happened in their life, they would have learned more already. They would be easier to teach. They would be more responsive to instruction. They would learn better on their own. There's no question about that. But it is also true that when they learn, it lightens the burden of their trauma. When you can engage them, you for a moment distract them from their trauma. You take them away from their hypervigilance. You soothe their brain. When you are able to teach them something, when they are able to see themselves learn, it tilts their life ever so slightly back in the other direction. It is true that trauma has a terrible, terrible negative effect on learning and relationships. But it's also true that learning and relationships soothe and heal and treat trauma. It's also true that trauma recovery, if we cannot wait for children and adults to recover from trauma for the other good things to happen, because for most of them, trauma recovery is going to go on for their whole life. They're not going, if you're waiting for the trauma to go away, you know, as one teacher said to me, he needs to go off to a treatment center and get treated so that he can come back and learn. I said, we're going to be waiting a really long time. Because trauma recovery for most people lasts a lifetime. People who have PTSD, for instance, once you have PTSD, you pretty much always have PTSD. Nobody gets over PTSD. They learn to live with it better. They learn to keep it, it gets smaller, but doesn't go away. It's a permanent neurological change in different sections of their brain, and we can see it on fMRI. The kids I've seen and treated who've experienced profound trauma, it's still real. You know, if you saw your mother killed and you go through treatment, you still saw your mother killed. That stuff's as real as it gets. But they learn to live with it better, and one of the ways they learn to live with it better is to go on and have successful educational experiences. We can't wait. You can't wait for the kids to get better before you teach them. I'm not suggesting that any of you would, but I have met such people. You cannot wait to teach them until they get better. We have to teach them. We have to find ways to instruct them. We have to create spaces and create opportunities to give them some educational success. Trauma has, so I should go back. I should ask you. Trauma has a negative impact on, right. Trauma is, you know, because it does, you know, if I had done that the way I was supposed to do it, you'd have created a list of things, and everything you might put on the list is true. Trauma has a negative impact on learning. Trauma has a negative impact on education and achievement. Trauma has a negative impact on relationships. Trauma has a negative impact on hopes and dreams. It has a negative impact on sleep. How many of you think you have kids in your class who sleep poorly? All of you have kids in your class who sleep poorly. I saw a kid what's interesting about that is I've learned over time when I interview kids about sleep to interview more carefully, because for years I would say, so do you have any problems with sleep? No, I sleep fine. Tell me how you sleep. Oh, I go to bed about 11 or 12 o'clock at night. How long does it take you to fall asleep? Like an hour or two. How do you know it takes that long? Because I look at the clock and a lot of times it's 2 o'clock before I fall asleep. I remember seeing the clock turn to 2 o'clock. I haven't slept yet. What time do you get up? Like 5:30 or 6. How do you sleep? I sleep fine. They're sleeping 3.5, 4, 5 hours a night, but they think they sleep fine. They think they sleep fine because they've always slept like this, and everybody around them sleeps like this, and it doesn't occur to them that you can sleep differently than that. Trauma has a negative impact on everything, literally on everything. People who've experienced trauma are less likely to survive cancer. People who experience trauma are more likely to experience every other diagnosable mental illness. The likelihood of it goes up if you've experienced trauma. You're more likely to get sick. You're more likely to stay sick longer. You're less likely to respond to treatment or medication. Trauma has a negative impact on literally everything. Reading and language have a positive impact on everything. Everything. I want you to see that remarkable flip side, the opposite sides of the same coin. One thing has a negative impact on everything. Reading and language, and I could add to that relationships, but we're really talking about reading and language at this conference. Reading, language, and relationships has a positive impact on everything. Everything. A guy I know, spent a week with at a conference, a guy, Karl Bell. If you ever get a chance, you probably won't because Karl's getting kind of old and I don't know how much of this stuff he does anymore. If you ever get a chance to see it, go to a conference with Karl Bell, go. Karl is a really cool dude. Karl is an African-American man. He's a psychiatrist. He ran a clinic for years outside the Robert Taylor homes on the south side of Chicago, specialized in treating people who behave violently. He had a never-ending list of clients who came to him from the criminal justice system, and he was treating them in a clinic across the street from where he lived. Now, what made this really interesting for Karl is, besides being a psychiatrist, he's also a world-class martial artist. Karl's a very dangerous man, if Karl wants to be. Part of what Karl talked about, though, that was very interesting was because of his ability to protect himself and to feel safe in any environment, he had the ability to approach people who had been traumatized, who were behaving violently. And he said the most effective thing he could do was simply to approach them and to find a way to ask them calmly, quietly, very personally, what can I do for you? What would help you right now? And in 20 or 25 years of doing that, nobody ever hit him. Nobody ever hurt him. Nobody ever tried to hurt him. But it's very hard to do that. It's very hard to approach people who are like that. One of the things that Karl said to all of us during that week that was very, very interesting was, he was across the street from the Robert Taylor homes, and he said there was a steady stream. There's always at least one study going on where people coming to the Robert Taylor homes, the largest housing project in the United States at the time. They're coming into the Robert Taylor homes, and they're trying to study why kids who were raised there didn't turn out so well. And Karl said, they're all idiots. Just rent an office across the street and watch everything that goes on. Study done. We know why the kids here aren't turning out very well. What Karl did was he went in and he studied the kids who did turn out well. He studied the kids who turned out remarkably well, given the fact that they had grown up in the same place, which was a factory for producing individuals, on this other arc of development. Some of these kids were on this arc up here, and he wanted to figure out why. One of the things that he figured out was these were kids who found academic success, that going to school felt good to them because they could be successful there. And the biggest thing they found was they all had at least one deep, meaningful relationship in their life. They had a relationship that gave them a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to go to school, a reason to come home, a reason to say no to the negative things, a reason to bother to recover, a reason to put the effort into survival. He had stories of kids who every day on their way home, they would stop and visit with a man at the corner store, or they would help a lady rake her leaves, or they would help somebody walk their dog. Those kinds of relationships that people look forward to. Trauma is the great toxin. It is the great stress. It is the great poison. Trauma and stress are the great poison that ruins and damages and hurts everything. Reading and language, on the other hand, are the great vaccine. Reading and language are the great vaccine that makes everything better. If I could give you one thing, I would give you the ability to have language, the ability to read and write. The great toxin meets the great vaccine. There's an obvious synergy there that we should not be surprised when reading and the ability to read is one of the most important things that we can do to generally meet the stress. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever been prescribed an antibiotic in the course of your life? Right. Except for strep throat, which is an exception. How many of you have ever had a doctor bother to culture the specific bacteria that was growing in or on your body? What do? They just give you what's called a broad spectrum antibiotic. They could pick up the bacteria and grow it in a dish and figure out what kind of bacteria it is. But you know what they do? They give you something that's good for whatever bacteria it might be. The broad spectrum antibiotic. In the world of child development, the broad spectrum antibiotic is the ability to read. It's teaching somebody to read. And not just teaching them to read, but teaching them to read so that they can be successful at them, helping them to be successful at it, and, dare I say, teaching them to read correctly. Teaching them to read in the most effective way. So one of the things we know about reading is that there's a group of kids from fortunate backgrounds with really great brains and very little stress and trauma in their life that you could kind of teach them to read almost any way you wanted, and they would pretty much still turn out. They'd do a little better if you taught them the better ways, but in the end, they're going to do fine. My daughter kind of taught herself to read by the time she was 4 or 5. Her first grade teacher was just a god-awful reading teacher, but there's nothing she could do to harm her. You know, my daughter would come home from school and say, "What did you do in school today?" "Oh, we did this, we did this, we did this." "The teacher said this about reading." And then she'd look at me and she'd say, "That's not right. That's not what you do." I remember her say, I said, give me an example. She said, well, she was trying to help a boy figure out what a word was, and she was covering up the word and say, "Just think about it in your head. What would make sense?" She said, and I wanted to pull her hand off of that and say, "No, look at the letters." I thought, such wisdom. So there are kids like that who are going to learn to read no matter what. But for kids who have been stressed, who have been traumatized, whose brains have been disorganized, the brain of a traumatized child looks very much like the brain of a child who is predisposed to dyslexia. It looks very similar in terms of the right side bias. It looks very similar in terms of the general disorganization and the inefficiency. And they respond very much to the same structured, systematic, focused instruction that helps their brain to bring the right tools to bear on the subject at hand. The other thing you have to think about, one of the things that traumatized children are going to need more often when learning to read. So when you learn to read, how many of you have read Mark Seidenberg's book about learning at the speed of reading, language at the speed of sight? How many of you tried to read it and couldn't quite get through? Right. So, I told Mark after I got a copy of the book and he signed it, and Mark's a friend of mine and he mentions me in the book, which is pretty cool. He said, "So what did you think?" I said, "Well, I could only read about 15 or 20 pages at a time, and then I had to sit in a dark room and massage my head." because it was so dense, it was so overwhelming. But one of the really important points that Mark makes, Mark talks about something called statistical learning. What we mean by statistical learning, what he means by it, is what other people, it's slightly different, but what Mark would, it's a better description of what most of us would refer to as implicit or inferential learning. So the things you pick up that you don't even know you're picking up. Most people can't express consciously the rule for when to, they wouldn't know what the rule is for why the is not the. Why do we, the general rule of an open syllable, we would pronounce it as the, but we pronounce it as the. But there's a rule for it. Most people have internalized the rule. And I can get people to show that they know what the rule is, even if they don't know the rule. I don't have this slide for this. You can put up the phrase, imagine that you're a ring announcer in a boxing ring and you're announcing the champion over here, Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, and you want to emphasize that as much as you can. You say, Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world. People would be much more likely to say that than say the heavyweight. They say the. Why do they do that? Why do you know? That's grammatically correct too. Why does it become the instead of the? It's the when it has low morphological weight, when it carries almost no weight, carries no meaning. When we say the, it's short for the one and only, the only one. Now it carries meaning. It's got all this meaning attached to it. We see the. You don't know that, but you've inferred it. You've picked it up through statistical learning. If you give kids pseudo words that start with the letter C, kids who are good at inferential learning will know when to pronounce which C sound at the start of a word. If you ask them what's the rule, they may not know the rule unless you've taught it to them. But they may have inferred the rule. They may have picked it up through statistical learning. Think of statistical learning as sort of a game of filling in the blanks. So we teach you, I teach you this, I teach you this, I teach you this, I teach you this. You have these experiences, but the gaps between them you fill in, you infer those things inferentially through experience. Kids who are traumatized and stressed are not as good at statistical learning. They're not as good at inferring things. We're going to have to, kids like my daughter, when you're teaching her to read, basically all you had to do was say, this letter makes this sound. And from that she realized all letters make sounds. I can figure out what sounds the letters make. Before you get the next sentence out of your mouth, she had figured the whole damn thing out and she could read. So she had just sort of statistically inferred everything else. Most kids can't do that. Most kids can statistically infer significant parts of information, but not all of it. We have to give them landmarks along the way. We have to explicitly teach. Kids who struggle to read the most need more of those explicit landmarks so that the gaps they have to infer for themselves are smaller and smaller. Traumatized kids are going to need smaller gaps to infer. They're going to need more help doing that statistical learning, inferring those things. So the special link between reading, language, and trauma, all of that starts in the brain. The left versus the right thing, which I talked about. The other thing that reading and language do for kids who have been traumatized is it gives them precious success. It gives them a chance to feel like they are successful and not at something trivial. They are successful at something that's important, that they know is important. That they absolutely know is important. To give them that success is an extraordinary gift. I saw a young lady some years ago. One of the things I do, one of the jobs that I have in Milwaukee County is that when kids try to kill themselves and can't come to a psychiatric hospital yet because their suicide attempt was so serious, so they're treated at Children's Hospital in Milwaukee, a very fine children's hospital. But they're there with some legal paperwork that says when they're better, they still have to come and get this whole suicide thing all straightened out. Because they can't come to the hospital, I go to them. So I walked in one time on a young lady, high school age kid, who had actually come to us from another county in rural Wisconsin, and the police didn't have time put that legal hold for the suicide attempt on her, and so Milwaukee County Sheriffs had come over and done it for her, even though she wasn't a resident in Milwaukee County, while she was at the hospital. And I came into the room, and she was there with her mother and her older sister. She was about 16 years old. She was laying in bed. One of the things when you see kids laying in bed under these conditions, they all look tiny. She really was tiny, but they look really, really tiny. And I just remember how small she looked. And I came in and I started talking to her. And I was trying to find out kind of what went into all this. And I was talking to her and her mother, and her sister was chiming in a little bit. And I learned that in the previous year and a half, she had been sexually assaulted twice. The second time she was raped by the star athlete at a rural high school, and when she reported it to the police, it got him suspended from all his sports teams pending charges, which caused her to be an outcast at the school, so now she was being bullied by everybody. I learned that she did not live at home. Her parents had gotten divorced. It was kind of ugly. In the midst of that, she became estranged from both of her parents and started couch surfing from friends. So for about 18 months, she had been living with different friends for a few weeks at a time. Then she would skip to other friends, and she would come back to the other ones. And she was kind of on a rotating list of kind people who were giving her a place to live. But she was not living with her family. And I learned that she couldn't read. She was 16 years old, had accumulated almost no high school credits, in spite of the fact that her 3 older siblings were all in college and doing well. She was not reading. She was not doing well at school. And it was interesting because when I asked the question, as I sometimes ask it, when you first started in school, was anything harder for you? We had talked about the rape, and we had talked about the rapes, and we talked about everything else very easily, very matter-of-factly. There was very little motion. And when I asked, when you first started in school, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, was there anything that was harder for you? The room fell silent. And her mother looked away, and her sister looked away. And she looked at me, and I said, for instance, math, or possibly reading. And her mother started to cry. And her sister started to cry. And the girl looked at me and she said, I can't read. She said, I've never been able to read. And her mom and her sister recounted the experience of trying to teach her to read when she was little and sitting with her and reading. That experience that everybody's had when you work with a kid who's really severely dyslexic, that you work on them, you work so hard, you learn a word, you teach them a word, and 3 words later, a sentence later, there's the same word pops up. And it's like they've never seen it before. They talked about that and how frustrating it was. And I asked the girl, why she tried to kill herself. We were about 2 hours in before I asked that question. I asked her why she tried to kill herself. And she said, you probably think it's because I was raped. She said, that's not it. She said, it's the reading. She said, because the rapes, eventually those will be behind me, and I know that eventually I'll get back together with my family, and we'll get over things, and we'll be back together. She said, but the reading, that's forever. That's every day. Every day I get up, I can't read again. I called the reading specialist at her high school and said that the girl was 16 years old and as far as I could tell had no phonemic awareness. The reading specialist said, what's that? You were in the previous presentation, so you understand what Don Meichenbaum said. The other thing that reading does, is it gives you a chance to have success in school, which gives you a chance, if you're traumatized and stressed, to tread water until time works its magic. The number one thing that helps kids recover from trauma is time. But they have to keep their head above water for that to work. It's like being on a sunken ship out in the middle of the ocean and you know somebody's coming to get you, but it's going to be a few days. You need something to hang on to. You need success. You need something going on, something good. Ideally, reading or something like that, but something successful, something good, some relationship. Reading also has an impact on relationships. It gives us a chance to develop better language, which gives us a chance to have better I've already told you my true stories. I'm going to go out onto some very thin ice here, and this is going to take me a couple of minutes, but I want you to see if you can follow along. I consider myself a man of science, and I'm going to speculate the hell out of I'm going to take a very tiny little bit of science. I'm going to stretch it as far as you possibly can. I'm going to tell you where I think the science is going to lead us, where it's already leading us. So the first thing I'm going to tell you about is clapping and schizophrenia. If you go to somebody who's diagnosed, who's very clearly got the very serious mental illness of schizophrenia, and you stand behind them, you put electrodes on their head and you clap your hands twice. If I did that to any of you with the electrodes in your head, what I would see is I would see a spike with the first clap. With the second clap, I would see a smaller spike. Because by the time I get to the second clap, by the time the second clap happens, your brain says, heard that before, nothing new, got this, no big deal, don't need to put that much time and energy into it. If you go to somebody with schizophrenia and you clap your hands twice, you see a spike, and you see an identical spike. The brain struggles to recognize the similarity and familiarity of those two claps. It treats those two claps like they're two different things. It does not recognize that an important, and at some level they are different. They aren't the exact same volume. The first clap came after nothing. The second clap came after the first clap. They are different. The buh sound in the start of bat is different than the buh sound in the middle of rabbit, and is different than the buh sound at the end of tab. But, there's that buh sound again. If you can set those differences aside and recognize that at a deeper level, it's the same sound, you've got a leg up on reading. Folks who have schizophrenia, a guy, a psychiatrist who I'm going to go spend some time with this summer for some training, a guy named Dr. Friedman, he and his research team have shown that the reason they respond differently to the two claps is because of a pathway in the brain that fails to develop during the third trimester. There's a part of your brain that's trying to say, yes, those are different, those are all different, yes, all different claps. And there's another part of your brain that balances that out and says, chill, take it easy, those are all the same thing, don't make a big deal out of it. That's familiar, I'm familiar with that. There's a tension between these two parts of the brain. And the second pathway in the brain is underdeveloped in folks with schizophrenia, and they struggle to make that develop. By the way, children of mothers of schizophrenia at 6 weeks of age show the deficit. At 6 weeks. Their brains are responding differently to the two clap test than the brains of typical children. This pathway is also implicated for other people in a higher risk for depression, a higher risk for anxiety, and a higher risk for most major mental illness. Mothers, this pathway, the development of this pathway during the third trimester of development is dependent on the availability of the nutrient choline. In 2017, the American Medical Association recommended that the prenatal vitamins, all prenatal vitamins include at least 450 milligrams of choline. The average prenatal vitamin includes 50 milligrams of choline. You get a lot of choline through certain foods as well, but it's important that people get it. How many of you remember taking prenatal vitamins? How many of you remember the importance of the one nutrient that was more important than all others? Do you know what it is? Folic acid. Do you know why folic acid is more important? Because if you get enough folic acid, it cuts the rate of anencephaly, microcephaly, and spinal tube defects by 50%. Making sure that pregnant women get folic acid has cut the rate of those disabilities by 50%. We think that maybe in making sure that pregnant women have enough choline in their diet while they're pregnant may cut the rate of some of these serious mental illnesses by 50%. Dennis Mulfease, who I mentioned this morning, Dennis Mulfease, I want you to think about the similarity of this to the clapping thing. Dennis Mulfease can show in brains of infants and in adults and anybody at any age. He can play phonemes through microphones on your head, through headphones, phonemes that are unfamiliar to you, phonemes from a language that you've never heard, phonemes your brain has never heard. He can play them into these headphones, and he can watch your brain after 2, 3, 4, 5 exposures. He can mark the moment at which your brain said, nope, got that, heard that, I know that sound, that's now familiar to me. And then he can play some music for you. You can come back a little later. He can play the same sound for you. And if it's maybe the first time, it treats it like it's unfamiliar. And then very quickly, your brain says, nope, this is that same sound I heard before. This is familiar to me. Sounds similar to something else? He can show in dyslexic children only a few days or a few weeks old, children at risk for dyslexia, that their brains struggle to do that. They struggle to become familiar with those little elements of sound and to treat them as something they've heard before. They struggle with that. They struggle with the difference between what is familiar and is unfamiliar. And now I've stretched the science as far as I possibly can. So I'm way out on a limb here. I have a very strong suspicion that they're going to find eventually an underdeveloped neurological pathway that needs to be there to balance out that process of learning, to balance out the brain's decision about whether a thing is familiar or not. One of the things that's critical to recognize is our brain all the time, more times than you can imagine, is deciding all the time what matters, what's important, what's not important, what's familiar, what's unfamiliar. The only way you can take an address and walk down the street of an unfamiliar city and find out where you are is that you can screen out all kinds of things that don't matter. You can say, that doesn't matter, that's familiar to me, I don't care about that, that difference doesn't matter. That the brains of these kids struggle with that. Is there a pattern there? I suspect there is. I think it has implications for statistical learning. Again, the importance of bringing the explicit instruction closer together, creating shorter gaps that kids have to fill in with statistical learning, less that they have to infer for themselves. We're going to need to teach them things explicitly that other kids pick up implicitly. And then the AMA recommendation from 2017. One of the most important things you can do for a child who has been stressed and traumatized, who's finding it difficult to read, is to keep calm, to strip emotion out of what's going on. I know that some of you, I hope not too many of you, when a kid gets something, when they go, that's great, whoa, and everybody gets all excited. Kids who've been traumatized have a hard time figuring out whether it's a good thing or not, why you're doing it, staying calm, minimizing emotion, minimizing stimuli, keeping the environment as reduced as possible, not having too many things to pay attention to, not having too many things that they have to worry about. Is this important? Is this not important? One of the challenges for kids who have been traumatized, who are taught to read in ways that are unfortunately too popular, is that when we give them one of those bookmarks that say, here's the 15 ways to figure out a word, 14 of which don't actually work, they struggle compared to other kids to figure out that 14 of these don't actually work. They really think this is something I'm supposed to be paying attention to. They don't know. When we tell them, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at the picture, look at this word, look at this word, look at this word, they don't know where they should put their importance. Simplifying it down as much as possible, bringing them back to the things that really work. And then for traumatized kids, explain, narrate, make transparent. That is, what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're thinking about things, the thinking that's going on in your mind, sharing with them what you're doing and why you're doing it, why you're reacting the way you are, making that transparent so that they can see your thinking out loud. Because they're very concerned about your thinking and your motivations, so let them know what your thinking and your motivations are. If you say, this is great, we're done early today, They wonder, are we done early today because you're mad at me? Are we done early today because I failed? Are we done early today because you don't care about me? If the answer is we're done early today because you've done a great job and today is a beautiful day outside and I want you to be able to get outside and enjoy it, we're done early today because there's a special program going on in your classroom and I don't want you to miss it, let them know that. Make sure they understand and know all the reasons for things. Be steady. As they go up and down, you go up and down with them. Don't ever go as high as they go. Don't ever go as low as they go. Follow them, but you have to be steady. You have to be their rock, which means not being too enthusiastic about their success, not being too upset about their failure. Calm, steady. As you know, we have to be ungodly patient. It is the patience which is unnatural. It is not natural to be this patient, particularly with somebody else's kids. But there's a tremendous payoff down the road. And to remember that this is always a two-way street. So we want to plow both sides of the road. That in whichever street we're talking about, it is worth the time, as much as I believe in the explicit and systematic instruction of reading and language abilities, it is worth the time to build the relationship. It is worth the time to take time out. It is worth the time to set some of that instruction aside now and then, to build the relationship, to build the trust, to let somebody feel comfortable. When you know, there's something going around on Facebook right now about a teacher who posted something about a girl who fell asleep in his classroom, and he was careful not to wake her up because he knew how busy she was, how hard she worked, how much work she does, how stressful her life is, and he recognized she just needed to sleep. I'm not suggesting that we let kids sleep unless they really need to, but all those things matter. I worry sometimes that our solution to better reading instruction is always more minutes of instruction. I worry that we're not filling kids' lives with the richness and the beauty and the wonder, so that even if they learn to read, what the hell are they going to read about? What are they going to know about the world? Where's their background knowledge coming from? You know, and that, you know, your relationship will not teach the child to read, but it's going to be hard to teach them to read unless they have a relationship with you, particularly the kids who need it the most. You know, the kids who learn to read easily, they can read from any doofus, you know, they can learn from anybody, it doesn't matter. But the more a kid struggles, the more a challenge it is. There's got to be that connection there. Now, I want to say to you, as somebody who does a related form of work, it's emotionally dangerous to be that emotionally connected to that many people who've got that much shit going on in their life. You know, I've got a little bit of like trauma and stress related disorders just because of the kids I've seen. I can't drive through the city of Milwaukee anymore without seeing houses that I remember what happened there and who lived there and what I learned there and what they told me there. So take care of yourself, you know, take care of yourself. Do what you need to do. Talk to each other. Talk to other people. Give yourself credit for what you do. Don't beat yourself up so much about the one kid who can't read. Don't beat yourself up so much about the kid who just can't get that last thing. Remember the 7 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 50 things you did teach them that they learned successfully. And whether you know it or not, because they're never going to come back and tell you. You know, I had the extraordinarily rare opportunity of being told. You know, that's what was so unusual about it. You all have kids who, and you'll know what I mean about this, you all have kids who haven't killed somebody because of you. You know? That means something. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. To have the chance to be connected to people at a time in their life that they need that connection, that is a rare thing. That is a rare privilege. You know, teaching kids to read is great. And it's among the most important things that go on. but to be connected to another human being at a stage of their life that they desperately need that connection, very few people get to do that. That's an extraordinary thing, and so appreciate that privilege. And I'm going to stand around and be around all day and let people talk to me and ask me questions and pick my brain or tell me I'm full of shit or whatever you want to do. Please understand when I say, because I mean it, when I say the respect I have for what all of you do, the circumstances under which you do it, I deal with some really, really difficult kids. I deal with them one at a time, Holy shit. I mean, God, you guys just, wow. It's just amazing to me that you get to be a part of that and you get to see it and you get to be there while it all happens. You guys juggled chainsaws, That's extraordinary stuff, and I have just the greatest possible respect for all of you, and thank you all for being here.